And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. What does it mean to be someone, truly, continuously, recognizably, across time, memory, and change? This essay does not offer a definitive theory of identity. Instead, it moves inward, listening for the quieter rhythms of selfhood that precede explanation. Drawing on a deeply embodied sensibility, it traces the contours of being a person, not through role, memory, or performance, but through the steady, often unspoken act of returning to one's own perspective. Without pronouncement or spectacle, it explores how we remain ourselves, even when language falters, when memory fades, or when the world no longer recognizes us. This is not a search for what the self is, but for how it endures, softly, rhythmically, and from within. It begins not with a thought, but with a feeling, an indistinct warmth that spreads through the body, subtle and unprovable, yet foundational. Before memory gathers itself into story, before the external world confirms a name or a role, there is a moment in which something inside us says, "I am this." Not as a conclusion drawn from evidence, nor as a label applied by others, but as an intuition that belongs entirely to the first person. This simple declaration, strangely tautological and yet charged with meaning, marks the beginning of personal identity, not as a social construct or cognitive pattern, but as a lived bodily event. The sense of being oneself precedes the content of the self. This earliest self-recognition resists easy analysis. It's not a concept of identity as such, but rather the space in which identity becomes possible. It is the point from which mind and body converge, neither reducible to psychological continuity nor to physical presence. The self that begins to take shape here does so not through isolated cognition, nor through material substance alone, but in the interplay, perhaps even the co-implication of both. Some have tried to find the self by looking inward only to encounter fleeting impressions. Others have looked to the stability of the body or to chains of memory. But each of these, taken alone, falters. What matters is that this early sense of self is not confirmed by argument or recognition, but by presence. To know oneself is in part to feel that one is there. That feeling cannot be fully accessed by others, nor verified by third-person observation. It is a knowing that comes before evidence, a soft certainty, not unlike what some thinkers have described as a necessary condition for experience itself. It's neither an object nor an idea, but a precondition for both. We may never fully know where it begins, but from this foundational sense arises the possibility of narrative, obligation, agency. The sense that one is a self over time becomes entangled with the expectations of others, the stories we inherit, the roles we perform. But these are extensions. At the heart remains that initial contact with being. It cannot be reverse-engineered behavior or reduced to data. It is not the kind of knowledge that can be taught. It is simply what allows a person to begin to speak of themselves at all. And so identity, far from being a fixed point in space or a name that travels unchanged across time, may be better understood as a quiet fidelity to that first awareness, a thread woven not from certainty, but from the steady re-encountering of the self as both felt and unfolding. Not loudly, but recognizably. We often speak of memory as the tether that binds a person to their past, as if remembering were the only thread strong enough to carry the self across time. But memory is porous. It leaks, refracts, rearranges. It carries fictions alongside truths and sometimes forgets what matters most. If identity depended solely on accurate recall, then each lapse would diminish us. And yet we do not feel ourselves dissolving with every forgotten name or lost afternoon. Something remains, a feeling of continuity that does not require perfect memory to endure. This suggests that memory's role is less about content than contour. It offers a shape to inhabit, not a ledger to consult. Even when the specifics are gone, the texture of having been remains. We may no longer recall the story, but we remember the weight of its chapters. What matters is not always what happened, but that it happened to us, that it happened from here, from this quiet vantage point we continue to occupy. To explain this persistence, some thinkers have turned to psychological continuity. patterns of thought, desire, and personality stretched over time. But these patterns are also changeable. They respond to grief, age, injury. We are not the same after loss, nor should we be. The self, if it is to remain alive, must be able to bend. Identity, then, cannot be the preservation of a static form. It must be the recognition of a rhythm, of a return to presence, even as its shape shifts. This rhythm is often subtle. It may surface in the way we speak to ourselves when no one is listening, or in the pull we feel towards certain landscapes, stories, gestures. These are not grand declarations of selfhood. They are quiet signs that the same consciousness has arrived again. Perhaps a little changed, perhaps uncertain, but still moving through the world from within. And so the self persists not through exact replication, but through a kind of coherence that allows for difference. A self can grow, fracture, even forget, and still remain recognizable. It does so not because it clings to a single form, but because it keeps returning to a familiar posture, to an orientation that says, however softly, this is being lived from here, and here, though altered, is still me. Much of what we experience as identity is shaped not in solitude, but in relation. The self, though felt from within, is also formed in the space between gazes, in the texture of being addressed, remembered, needed. We learn who we are not just by reflecting inward, but by watching how the world turns when we enter a room, by noticing which stories are told about us and which are withheld. This doesn't make identity a performance, but it does remind us that being someone is not done alone. Still, what others see is never the whole. The gaze can misrecognize, the name can miss. There is always a remainder, something inside that resists capture, even by those who know us best. This tension between the self that feels and the self that is seen is not a flaw. It is part of the human condition. It makes space for privacy, for innerness, for the quiet sense that I am not reducible to what is said of me. That even when I am named wrongly, I am still here. Philosophically, this is where some accounts fracture. If the self is only what is remembered or recognized, then what of those whose histories are lost or whose minds shift? If the self is only a narrative, then what becomes of those whose story cannot be told? There must be something more fundamental, a layer of identity that is not earned or constructed, but given, something closer to presence than performance. That presence may not always speak clearly. It does not explain itself, but it is felt. It appears in the way we return to ourselves after confusion, in the way we hold our own gaze in the mirror, in the way silence doesn't feel empty when it is ours. It is not dependent on language, but it is what makes language possible. Before we say I, we already are. This is why identity is not finally a question of structure, but of rhythm. It is the recurrence of this perspective, this center, this orientation, not always clearly, not always the same way, but recognizably. And when the world fails to affirm us, when memory loses its grip, or when roles disappear, this rhythm can still hold. It may soften, quiet, retreat, but it does not vanish. It continues gently to affirm what has always been true. I am this, and I return. Even in our most fragmented states, when names escape us, when roles dissolve, when memory stutters, there is often a residual sense that something remains. Not a concept, not a narrative, but a presence. This is not the kind of presence that requires proof or performance. It's the kind that sits quietly beneath the noise, steady as breath, unnoticed until it's threatened. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't demand recognition, but it's what lets us feel, in moments of disorientation, that we are still somewhere. Still someone. This presence is not the product of reasoning. It is not summoned by will or assembled by thought. It's the condition that allows those things to happen in the first place. Without it, there would be no question of identity at all. It's what endures when categories fail. And it's why even the loosest sense of self feels tethered, not to a name, but to a position. A way of being in the world that, however altered, still returns to the same internal coordinates. Some philosophies describe this as continuity of consciousness, others as an ongoing act of self-interpretation. But beneath these models lies a more elemental reality, that we encounter the world from a singular interior, that there is always a here from which experience unfolds. It may be fragmented, it may be fading, but it is never duplicated. No one else lives from your center. No one else hears the world from inside your silence. This is not to elevate the self into something sovereign or exceptional. It is simply to recognize its irreducibility, to note that being someone is not a matter of achieving a stable identity, but of continuing to experience from a recognizable interior. The self is not fixed, but it is not interchangeable either, and that tension between flux and fidelity is where personhood finds its depth. In this light, identity is not a claim to be defended, but a rhythm to be honored. A rhythm that may be interrupted, that may go quiet, but that reasserts itself in small ways, in how we greet ourselves after sleep, in the recognition of our own voice, in the stillness that follows being called by name. These are not proofs, they are pulses, and each one says simply, I'm still here. What endures across a life is not a static self, but a pattern of return, a quiet fidelity to a way of inhabiting the world. This fidelity doesn't resist change. It makes change bearable. It doesn't insist on sameness. It traces coherence through difference. Over years, we forget more than we retain, shift more than we plan, become more than we expect. And still, when we pause, when we listen in, something in us recognizes the place from which we are living. The posture may be different, the context transformed, but the angle of being, the way the world is met from within, feels known. There's a comfort in this rhythm, even when it is fragile. It reassures us that we are not lost, even when we cannot fully explain ourselves. It reminds us that identity is not a conclusion we reach, but a presence we continue to arrive from. This arrival may be uncertain, it may carry doubt, but it is also what allows us to try again, to speak in our own voice, to stand in our own shape, even when neither feels familiar. In times of rupture, this rhythm can go quiet. Illness, grief, dislocation, these can interrupt the sense of being recognizably oneself. And yet something still moves, something returns. Not loudly, not in words, but in the small acts of persistence. The way we sit with a thought that won't settle. The way we walk a path that once mattered. The way we reach, unconsciously, for something known. These gestures may not prove identity, but they enact it. They keep us close to a self we no longer fully name. There's no final test for this, no formula that can decide when a self is still present. But there is a truth that many recognize quietly, that the self is not undone by change but by neglect. When we stop listening for that pulse, when we stop returning to our center, the thread frays. Not because the self is gone, but because it is no longer met. Identity in this light is not about maintaining control. It is about remaining in conversation with the place from which one speaks, and so to remain oneself is not to remain the same. It is to keep arriving at that inner threshold again and again, not always sure, not always strong, but recognizably. Even when everything else has shifted, the rhythm can still say, I am here, I am this. We tend to imagine identity as something we carry, a fixed inheritance, a story we know by heart. But perhaps it is more like a doorway we pass through repeatedly, each time bringing with us a slightly different version of the self. The threshold doesn't move, but we do. What it means to be someone may lie not in staying the same, but in returning through that same opening with a continuity of presence, however altered. The world changes, we change. But the act of crossing, of recognizing the place we come from, remains. This is not the stability of repetition, it is the rhythm of fidelity. A fidelity not to who we were, but to the gesture of being this person again and again and again. It doesn't require memory, it doesn't require language. It only asks that we feel the shape of experience as our own. That even in silence we know it is us who are there. This knowing is not conceptual. It arrives through breath, posture, tone, through the way time feels when we are alone with it. In this sense, identity is not a possession but a relationship between the self and its own becoming, between presence and recognition. It cannot be held. It can only be returned to, and that return may not always be smooth. There will be times when the self feels unreachable, when nothing familiar answers back. But even then, the possibility of re-entry remains. The threshold does not close. The rhythm only quiets. There's a kind of ethical tenderness in this way of understanding identity. It doesn't demand performance. It doesn't punish change. It allows for interruption, for forgetting, for uncertainty. And in doing so, it makes space for those whose selves unfold differently, for those who return slowly or at odd angles or with unfamiliar steps. It honours the pulse of perspective, not the coherence of a script. So when we ask what it means to be someone, we might stop searching for a perfect account. We might listen instead for that subtle recurrence, the way a person moves through their own life, not always steadily but recognizably, not as the same but as themselves. That is enough. That is what holds. A thread not of fact but of feeling, a rhythm not of answers but of arrival. Still here, still this. To belong to oneself is not to stand apart from the world, but to meet it again and again from the same inner ground. That ground may shift, it may soften, but it is known by the way experience settles into it, the particular weight of time, the texture of memory, the sound of one's own silence. We recognize ourselves not through certainty, but through the feeling of orientation. This is where I speak from. This is where I feel. This is where the world lands when it touches me. This orientation is not fixed in form. It accommodates the new, absorbs the unexpected. It stretches to include what was once unthinkable. And yet through it all, it remains ours. Not because we hold it tightly, but because we keep returning to it. Identity, then, is not a doctrine or a mirror. It is a path that knows our steps, even when we forget where we were going. It is a relationship with a centre that is neither static nor fragile, but rhythmically faithful. In this light, the self is not an answer we arrive at, but a place we return from. It is not a list of traits, nor a set of memories, nor a summary of actions. It is the singular quality of being the one who lived this moment, who felt this breath, who received this sky. It is presence before description, orientation before role, and it endures not through assertion, but through recognition. The quiet, internal nod that says, yes, I know this view. This may be why certain moments undo us, not because they threaten the self, but because they show us its depth. A forgotten photograph, a familiar scent, the way someone says our name, all reminders that we have been living this life from within, even when we weren't looking. These are not proofs. They are touchstones, and they reveal that identity is not composed, but remembered, not as content, but as atmosphere. So the work of being someone is not to hold everything together. It is to remain in touch with the place from which we unfold, to listen for the rhythm that makes this life feel like ours, even as it transforms. To keep crossing the threshold of selfhood with openness, with attention, with grace, and to know each time that the crossing itself is what makes us whole. And if identity is this rhythm, a continued crossing, a returning not to sameness but to coherence, then its deepest truth may lie not in definition, but in endurance. To endure as oneself is not to remain unchanged, but to remain in relation to that centre from which life is lived. The centre does not need to be precise. It does not require a name. It simply needs to be returned to, recognised in the hush between thoughts, the pause before speech, the inward glance that says, still me. This is what holds us when language frays, when memory thins, when others no longer reflect us clearly. It's not a theory, it's not even a belief. It's a way of being present that affirms itself in its very act of presence, like a tone you recognise without knowing its key, like the way you reach for a familiar light switch in the dark, not because you're certain, but because your body remembers the shape of belonging. In this sense, identity is not a form to be preserved, but a fidelity to presence. It is not the same as history, nor is it only consciousness. It's the echo of being that persists through silence, through change. It's what remains when we stop performing, when we stop narrating, when we stop trying to explain. And in that moment of stillness, it speaks again, not loudly, but surely, I am this. Perhaps this is what makes the self feel real, not that it is provable, but that it returns, that no matter how far we drift, some part of us remains attuned to its own unfolding, not because we are consistent, but because we are located. We are someone, not because we can say who we are, but because there is a centre from which our life has always moved outward. And so identity is not an answer. It is a rhythm we keep, a rhythm that softens and strengthens, that vanishes and reappears, but that always draws us back to the place where experience becomes personal. That place may change, it may feel distant, but it is never elsewhere. It is here, it is this. And in returning to it, we remember not everything, not perfectly, but enough to say, I am still this. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.